Okay, so this lecture is going to cover reinforcement schedules or schedules of reinforcement. So what are schedules of reinforcement? A schedule specifies which responses will be followed by a reinforcer. Okay, so it determines how often a reinforcer is going to be delivered to the organism. Now, as I mentioned before in the lecture on reinforcement, there are something called continuous and intermittent reinforcement. So I talked about this in the partial reinforcement effect, right? And how fast behavior distinguishes. But recall that continuous reinforcement is when the behavior is always followed by a reinforcer each and every time. Okay, we often use this when an organism is learning a new behavior. So we reinforce the behavior every single time. Intermittent reinforcement is when not every response is followed by a reinforcer. So only occasionally the response will be reinforced. We often use this during maintenance. So when we're trying to maintain a behavior, but the individual has already learned it, and you just want that behavior to occur over a long period of time. Okay, so continuous, it's reinforced every single time. Intermittently, it's only reinforced occasionally. That's kind of what this looks like. So you see on the left-hand side, we've got continuous, and after every response, a reinforcer is delivered. But on the intermittent, only every fourth response is delivered. Now, there are 4 different types of schedules of reinforcement that determine when those reinforcers are going to be delivered. So first, we have what is called a fixed ratio schedule, and we shorten that to FR, okay, fixed ratio. This involves giving a reinforcer after a fixed number of non-reinforced responses. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that there's a required number of responses the animal or organism has to engage in before they're given a reinforcer. So for example, if we have an FR20, that's a fixed ratio 20, the reinforcer is not delivered until after the 20th response. Okay, so that number indicates what number of responses is required for the organism to receive the reinforcer. And this graph just sort of shows you what that looks like on a fixed ratio performance or a fixed ratio run. Every time you see a tiny little side dash, that's when a reinforcer was delivered. So a rat most likely is pressing a lever here. They press the lever 20 times, they get reinforcement. They press the lever 20 times, they get reinforcement, and so on and so forth. Okay. There's a slight little pause in responding here. Typically, the organism is consuming the reinforcer, right? Water or food, or they might be satiated. So if they've gotten enough food or water, they might not engage in the behavior as quickly as they did in the beginning. So there's a little arrow there pointing to sort of the plateau in the graph, and it's called a pause after the reinforcement has been delivered. So this is performance on a fixed ratio schedule. An example of a fixed ratio schedule is a student gets money for every 5th A she receives on a test. So mom and dad say, all right, we got to get your grades up on these tests, on these math tests, let's say. So for every 5 math tests you get an A, we'll go out for dessert wherever you want to go, or we'll give you $10 or something like that, right? So that's a fixed ratio schedule. The child has to engage in a fixed number of responses. In this case, it's 5, right? And the response is getting an A, and then the reinforcer is delivered. Now, we can also have something called a fixed interval schedule, or an FI. So this involves giving a reinforcer for the first response that occurs after a fixed time interval has elapsed. Okay, reinforcement is not given before the interval has elapsed. So if the time is still going, then any responses that occur before that time has passed are not going to be reinforced. So for example, we can have a fixed interval or an FI 20 seconds. In this case, the reinforcer is delivered for the first response that occurs after 20 seconds has elapsed. So how this works is, say you have a rat in a chamber pressing a lever, right? They can press the lever the whole time that time is going. But until 20 seconds has passed, they're not going to get reinforcement. And then once that 20 seconds has passed, they have to engage in at least one response after the 20 seconds. So that first response that occurs after 20 seconds has gone by, that's the response that's reinforced. And this is the type of responding we get. So it's still sort of a steep increase, but it's not as steep as the fixed ratio performance, right? So again, we often see the organisms engaging in a lot of responses towards the end of the 20 seconds. That's typically what we see for the performance. An example of a fixed interval. So every year on the day after Thanksgiving, retail stores have large discounts in preparation for Christmas, right? Black Friday. Shopping before the sale doesn't provide you the same reinforcer, right? You might not get the same deal or the same discount on items. It's only after a whole year has passed and we're on Black Friday that you get those deep discounts when you go shopping. Okay, so that's a fixed interval. It's a whole year, right, that you have to wait. And then the response that occurs after that interval has passed is reinforced, right? So if you go shopping on Black Friday, you get really good deals. We also have what is called a variable ratio schedule. So we have fixed ratio and we have variable ratio. Okay, this entails giving a reinforcer after a variable number of responses. So in this, for like a VR20 or variable ratio 20, the reinforcer is given after an average of 20 responses. Okay, and that average, it varies around a number, and the number is 20. So in this case, the rat's pressing the lever, and let's say they get reinforced after 16 presses. But then next time they don't get reinforced until 22 presses. And then the next time it's like 18. And then the next time it's 23, and so on and so forth. All of those numbers will average out to 20, essentially. But it's not a fixed number, not like we had in a fixed ratio. This is a variable ratio. And this is the type of responding we see here. An example of a variable ratio schedule would be a salesperson makes phone calls to sell products. So the number of calls that have to occur before a sale, which is the reinforcer, is variable, right? They don't know how many calls they have to make. But the more calls they make, the more likely they are to sell something, to get someone to say, okay, I'll buy it, right? So that's a variable ratio schedule. They have to engage in a number that varies of responses before that reinforcer is available to them. And the last schedule we have is a variable interval schedule. So this entails providing the reinforcer for the first response after a variable time interval has elapsed. So we had fixed interval and we have variable interval, right? So unlike the fixed one, that was a fixed amount of time, right? This one's variable, around an average of time. So the reinforcer in a VI 20 seconds or a variable interval 20 seconds, the reinforcer is given for the first response that occurs after an average of 20 seconds has elapsed. So again, an average of 20 seconds elapses, and then the first behavior that occurs after that is the one that's reinforced. An example of this is checking your phone to see if there are any text messages waiting for you. Now, your behavior is not reinforced based on the number of times you check your phone, right? That would be a variable ratio. Variable interval, it takes time for people to contact you or text you. Some friends text you back really fast. Some take a long time, or even the same friend, right? Sometimes they respond right away. And sometimes if they're at work or something, or maybe they're driving, they might take longer to respond. So this is a variable interval schedule. So your response is not reinforced until a certain amount of time has passed. And usually this is a variable amount of time, right? It's not fixed. It's not the same every time. And again, this is just showing you the 4 different respondings when we're on certain intervals. So you can see that the steepest increase is on a variable ratio, and it just sort of continues, right? They never really stop. On a fixed ratio, the responding kind of has a little pause after they've gotten the reinforcer, because remember, they might be consuming the reinforcer, or there's sort of like a satiation that occurs where they don't really, the organism might not be as motivated to get the reinforcer. But on a variable ratio, we see it just constantly increasing. And same thing with a variable interval, it's just not increasing as steeply. And then for fixed intervals, we often get this kind of scalloping thing on the graph, that type of responding, because like I said, What eventually happens is the animal learns not to press the lever at the beginning because they're not going to get reinforcement at the beginning. So they start pressing the lever a lot at the end because more often than not, more likely, they're going to get the reinforcer at the end of the interval. And that's it for schedules of reinforcement.